Hi everyone, on today's video we're gonna be covering sensors. So as always, the first thing you need to do is go to Canvas and download the sensor example template. This one will give you a project that looks like this. We're gonna have um, two XMLs. We're just gonna be using one of them. So you're gonna be using the activity main.xml. As you can see, we have some text views here. We're gonna be using them to display some information. And then we're gonna have a button that will take us to a second activity. So on the second activity is going to be a list activity that we're going to use to list all of the sensors available in our device. And on the main activity, we're going to be reading some sensors and showing the information on the views that we have here. Now you're going to find a bunch of template code. All of it should be fairly familiar to you. So we have just some buttons. We have a click listener that is going to take us to the second activity that's already created. Then we also have method calls, check sensors. We're going to be writing the actual functionality for it later on, but all that is going to do is make a snack bar when it's true with a message, or make a snack bar with a different message if it's false. Toast. We also have some on resume and on pause. We're going to be using those later on, and just a simple on create that sets the layout and registers the listener to the button. On the second activity, all that we have is an list activity with an empty on create. So we're going to be working on this one first. So the first thing that we want to do is to get the list of sensors that we have. So for this one, let's just create a list of type sensor. Sensor is the base class for all of the sensors that you will have access to in your device. Now, in order to be able to access the sensors themselves, you have to use a sensor manager. So for this one, you're gonna simply use the get system service. So similarly to how we did with the Google Maps, you're gonna get system service. You get an instance of that service, and what is service we want? We want the sensor service. So this is not a particular sensor. It is a service that allows you to access information for all of the sensors in your device. So let's create assign a value to the sensor list. So for this one, all that we're gonna be saying is sensor manager, get us the list of sensors. You have to provide a type. So in this case, the sensor class has all of the types of sensors that you have. So if you have accelerometer, temperature, gravity, all of these are the sensors that can exist on an Android device. In our case, since we want the list of all the sensors, we're just going to say type all. Now we're going to actually parse this sensor list to just extract the names of the sensors. So let's create an array list, and a linked list better. And this is going to be like a string. Now we're gonna use a for loop, and all that we're doing in this for loop is we're gonna traverse the sensor list, and then as we traverse the sensor list, we're just gonna extract the name of each sensor and adding it to our names part. So for this one, all you call is the get name method that will give you the name, and then after that, since we're using a list activity, we can set a list adapter just to set the data into that list, and then we need an adapter. So this is going to be a simple array adapter because we have a simple array of strings. So the adapter is going to be for type string, and this is going to be a new array adapter. The first thing we need to pass in is the context, the layout for each element. So we're going to use the default simple list item, and then the list of elements, which is going to be the sensor names in this case. Now let's run the app. So here is our app. Okay, that was an older version. Okay, so here's our app. There's a pressure sensor that's just showing up because we have true as the value there. So here we click the button and it takes us to all of the sensors that we have available in our device. Clicking on the items doesn't do anything. We don't have any on item selected listener, so or an item click or anything like that, so nothing will happen. We just have the list. So you can see the emulator has a gravity sensor, orientation, rotation, light sensor, proximity sensor. So that's it for that part. Now here we need to make sure that this is not null. So in our case, I'm sure that there's at least a sensor in our device, but it could be the case that you have a device that doesn't have a particular type of sensor, let's say a accelerometer. Your phone doesn't have that one, so if you pass this in and you don't have that type of sensor, this is going to be returning a null value. So you just want to assert that it is not null. This will throw an exception if this value is null and basically exit out your app. You could also have an if statement to validate that it's not null before you try to execute this functionality. Okay, now let's move on here. I'm just gonna change this to false, restart the app. Okay, so now pressure sensor. That's just because I changed this to false. Now, what we want this method to do is to check if a particular sensor exists in our device. So for that one, we're gonna use the type. So here, all that we have to do is the sensor and the type of sensor that we want. So in this case, I created all of those values there for the pressure sensor. So let's just press pressure, and then over here, what we want to check is that the type is different from not that is different. I want to check that it exists. So for that, I need to ask the sensor manager. So sensor manager, get me the default sensor for this type. So what this is gonna do is return the sensor that match that type. And here what I want to check is that it's not null. So if this value returns null, just as we saw over here, then it's gonna mean that there is no sensor for this particular type. Now the method is slightly different because here we're getting all of the sensors that match that type. You can have more than one sensor that match a type, such as the location sensor. And here we're just getting the default sensor. So that if this returns null, it means that there is not even one sensor for that particular type. So if this is not null, then we say that there is a pressure sensor. Why? Because we're checking if it's a pressure sensor just over here, but this could be used for any other type of sensor. Okay, now moving on, we're gonna be actually reading sensors. So for this one, we're gonna be using these text views. So the first thing that we need to do is over here, on the onCreate, we're gonna first initialize our sensor manager variable over here. So just as we did on the previous one, let's get the system service for the sensor manager. It still existed here, otherwise we would have thrown a null exception because of this one not being initialized. So it's good that it came back from the other one. Okay, now what we're gonna be doing here is first initialize the sensors that we want. In this case, we want a proximity sensor and a light sensor. So let's just do proximity sensor and then the light sensor afterwards. So to get the sensor, we're gonna be doing the same thing we did over here. Just get the default sensor. And then here we pass on the type. Now in this case, we want to get the type to be the proximity sensor. So it should be type proximity. It's the sensor manager. And over here, we're gonna be doing the same thing, but instead of proximity, this one is gonna be the light sensor. Now, same thing as before, we want to make sure that this doesn't return null. We can use assert statements, or we can use other values. In this case, we're making sure that the sensor manager is not null. If there's an error, this will return null. We also will want to make sure that the proximity sensor and the light sensor are not null. But in this case, we already know that they exist because they were on the list of sensors that we saw before. As you can hear, we have a light sensor and a proximity sensor. So once we have that, we actually want to register a listener for the sensors. So this will happen. You could do it on onCreate, but that means that the sensor is going to be active throughout the application, even if it's not open. So that will consume a lot of resources unnecessarily. So for the sake of battery saving and energy consumption, you will want to do the listeners on resume and then on register the listeners on pause, so that the sensor is only being read in your application when your application is actually on the foreground. Now it really depends on how your application works. If you need to be reading these values even when your application is on the background, then you may not want to do it this way, but in most cases you will want to do it in the on resume. So for this one, we're just gonna say sensor manager, and then we're just gonna be registering a listener. Now for the listener, we want to pass this. Now, right now, it's not gonna be working properly just because we need to actually add one more thing onto the class. So we want to know which sensor we're gonna be listening to, and then we want to tell Android the frequency at which we want to be listening for these events. So the way we do this is by calling the sensor manager, or not the sensor manager, but the sensor class, and then we're just gonna be looking for the delay. Sensor manager dot sensor delay. Okay, so this is the delay that we want to use. We either use the normal, game, or fastest. Normally, since this is not a sensor that we're using for a game, then we're just gonna use the sensor delay normal. And here you're gonna see that you cannot uh, resolve the method like this. Now this happens because we have yet to tell the Android emulator or the Android system that our class actually will have sensors. So in this case we have the sensor event listener. After having that, we actually have to override two methods. So I'm just gonna use these methods, override methods. Actually, this should be implement. These two methods, perfect. So on sensor change and on accuracy changed. Now notice that the moment we did that, this part works because now our class is also a listener or a sensor event listener. So we can register it to be a listener for the proximity sensor. Now we want to have register every single time for each sensor that we want. So we have to register for both proximity sensor updates and light sensor updates. Now when we want to do on the on pause is we simply want to unregister the listener. And then in this case we don't need to say which listener we want to or which sensor we want to stop listening, because our class itself is going to be the listener. So all that we have to do is unregister the class, which is the only listener, and by doing that we're unregistering it for all of the sensors that is been registered. Now if you create a similar to how we have done before in the past with the button listeners, you could create a sensor listener for each listener as a variable or as an inner class, and then in that case you will have to unregister each of those listeners. In this case, our listener is the class itself because we are implementing the sensor event listener. So all we have to do is call it once. Now, thus far, all that I would say is, okay, every time there is an update on the values of these particular sensors, our application will be notified of that. Now, when that happens, we will be calling the onSensorChange method. So similar to how the onClickListener works, that you call onClick. When the click happens, here is that every time the sensor changes or there's a new sensor event, your method will be called. Now keep in mind that this method does not necessarily mean that it's gonna be called every time the value of the sensor itself is gonna be changed. So if we have a proximity sensor there or a GPS sensor, for instance, even if your phone is put static, it hasn't changed on the GPS value, there is a new value update with a new timestamp. So this method will be triggered. It is not only on the value of the sensor, it's on the value of the event. And the event has the type of sensor, the value of the sensor, and a timestamp for when the reading was received or created. So this method will effectively trigger whenever there is a change in either the value of the sensor itself or there is a new reading which changes the timestamp. So in our case, we're just going to be looking at the values. So all that we're going to be doing here is first note that we have two different sensors. So this event will be triggered whenever any of those is updated. So just as we've seen before, we have to be able to tell the difference between one or the other. So in our case, this is a very easy thing to do. All we do is look at the sensor event, and then we get the sensor from it. We get the type of that sensor, and then we can simply compare it with the sensors that we want. So is this a proximity sensor? Oops, I already have to complete it. Or is this and this is going to be light, a light sensor. Now we could simplify this by simply saying integer type equals sensor event here, and then just comparing that type over here, comparing that type over here. You could also use a switch statement just for the sake of explaining everything. It's easier if I show it with an if statement. But you could effectively have a switch on type and just check the different sensor types that you want to check. Which, if you have more than two, is going to be better than using a lot of else if nested statements like this. So on this case, we want to get the value itself. So in this case, we're gonna see the proximity of that value, and then we're gonna just create it as a string here, and then what you have to get is the event dot values. And in this case, these have only one value, so we're just gonna get item at position 0 of the values array. Same thing for the light value, it only has one. And then this is going to be used. So in this case, proximity text view, we're gonna set the text to be the proximity of data string. Now, if you have something like a gyroscope, you will have three values. So you have the X, the Y, and the Z coordinates. So you can have more than one value, just that the sensors that we're using right now only have one. So we only need to get position 0. No, that's not it. We want to light text view, and then I'm just gonna copy paste. This is going to be light update. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our application. You also have the onAccuracy changed method. This will change if we have the accuracy of the sensor has changed. Now that is not very common, but it can happen, for instance, with some sensors that have different accuracies. In this case, we could refer to the location sensor, that you can have the coarse or the fine grained location. So if that changes the accuracy of the sensor, then this method will be called. Now that is very rare with many sensors, but it can be useful sometimes, especially if you depend on high accuracy or letting your user know about those changes. Now I think I might have something over here. No. Oh, here's our app. Okay, I thought I had maybe crashed the app. Okay, so as you can see, we have numbers here. Now, if you're wondering what do these numbers mean, well, in your actual phone, it will depend on where the sensors are. But in our case, we actually have the virtual sensors, so you can just modify the values. If you come here to virtual sensors, you will see the rotation sensors. Now, if we were using the rotation here, then we will see it. Let me actually make this straight again. But you also have other different values. So if you go to the additional sensors, this is where you will find the other sensors that you have. So in our case, we have the proximity and the light sensor. So we go to proximity. Notice that whenever I update it, it's actually reflected there with the value. Okay, and that's it for the sensors. Now let's just make a small change over here, just so you can see. this, and this is going to be the crux. Same big one. There's the length, and then we're going to show. Now let's run our app again. So the additional sensors, that's the ones that we're going to be touching anyway. So notice how the event is being triggered a lot. That happens because of the event delay. So let's go over here. So sensor delay normal, that is the rate at which the sensor is going to be read. So notice that it happens quite frequently. And then you got like 7 different updates. It's not 7, but it's quite a good number of updates because they are based on the timestamp when those updates are happening, even though the value is constant. So what the sensor delay means is that every couple seconds the sensor will automatically be read just to update the value, and then your listener will update whenever you actually call it. Now the light will not be triggering that one, it's just on the proximity. Okay, now if we go to list the sensors, it just shows us the same thing that we had before. Okay, now I'm just going to remove this. And that's everything for the sensors. If you're dealing with different types of sensors, the most important part that you want to take into account is that if you have many sensors, you will have to make sure that you handle them properly on the sensor changed and that the sensors exist in your devices. So for that one, you will want to check if these values are null or not, and using these leak sensors will be a useful way to do it. But when you know the sensors that you're gonna be looking at, then you can simply get the default type, check if those are null or not, and that way you can know if the sensor actually exists. And then you can use that information within your app as you see fit. Okay, that's everything for this one. If you want to practice more with sensors, one thing that you can do is add a sensor for the, let me show you, for the accelerometer, and you can create a different set of text values, text views that you will use to show the rotation on the 3 different axes. So that's it for sensors, and that's it. Okay, thank you.